welcome to this second panel of the conference, which is devoted to ownership. We'll have short introduction by all of us in turn, and then we'll have a discussion with the audience. We plan to have at least half of this panel devoted to a conversation, which would be fun. Let me then first do a little introduction. Then Yupana is going to talk about Japan a bit, and Tobias about Germany, Lisa about the world, I guess, and Curtis is going to set it in perspective in our little introduction. So to start with, let me see whether this works. Yes. As you see on this slide, actually, what is fascinating is if you look at ownership at the beginning of the 20th century and ownership at the beginning of the 21st century, you see that what is fascinating is we have control or controlling persons in all firms, in most countries, if not in all countries, with the exception of the UK, which I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe the country is such a disarray that they are different than others. But we see that we see control, and not only do we see that we have control, we see that families play a very important part. And that is quite fascinating, because if you look at the families as such, they are the ones who drive the economy, and in particular, families might be a way of attracting confidence by investors in the sense that they have much at stake and that they are doing also potentially, if you look at history also, inventors or powerful business persons are driving large firms. And what we see, for example, in the US at the moment with Google and Amazon, where we see special shares for founders being there, we have this phenomenon actually which allows us to say that potentially not much is changing. We see the same thing coming over and over in different forms. It's also interesting to see that families are not only important in very large firms. If you look at Japan, or at least if you believe the Financial Times, there's one phenomenon that is occurring at the small enterprise level. Apparently, throughout Japan, the owners of firms don't find their heirs willing to take over. And it's a widespread phenomenon that implies that very many smaller firms either shut down after their current manager, owner retires, or the business is given to a business consolidator who repackages the firms and makes them into new one, which is kind of amusing because this phenomenon is one that had occurred in Japan also at the beginning of the 20th century. So we're going back to the same rhythm again. So what I wanted to say in the introduction is, in a fascinating way, we see that control has been important throughout history for large firms as well as for smaller firms. And the second part is that among those controllers, what's very important, or especially important, is families or founders more generally. And that is a characteristic that we find time and over again, both at the beginning of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century. And it's against this background that we have allocated the speeches in this little panel. Yupana, you would like to start?
Thank you for having me here today. Okay, so I'm from National University of Singapore, and right now I'm a research fellow at the Development Bank of Japan. I have been having a lot of fun, and this is my office. Look like it's fancy. You know, for those who've never been there, it's in Otemachi, where the fancy companies are there. On the head office of big companies are around there. Okay, and then my colleagues told me that if you look around this area, okay, it belongs to the Mitsubishi Group. Okay, the Mitsubishi Real Estate owns it. And if you cross the river to Kanda area, that's the Mitsui control the whole area. And they say, oh, the Sumitomo is there in Osaka area. They control the Kansai regions. Okay, so I think it is well known that when you ask who control large corporations, and there are these Keiretsu firms, and I think most of us study in the textbooks as well. Okay, and for these large firms, Keiretsu, they are firms on firms on firms. firms. I think ECGI is experts on that. And who control them? It's the salarymen, managers who control the firms behind that, right? But we agree with this, but I think maybe something missing, okay, when you look at large corporation. We learned a lot from looking at the real cases. And you look at Japan, Toyota, I think everybody knows about Toyota Motors, a large firm, right? And right now, it's about 161 billion market cap, okay? And the president or the CEO, the Japanese call them the president, so he is Akio Toyoda, all right? So it's kind of, yeah, the same family name, okay? Anyone have ever thought that this is family firm? So I asked this question to my students. And my students said, no, it is not family firms, okay? And I asked, why not? Large firm, okay, multinational company, okay, and well-organized, professionalized. Okay, and what is the image of family firms? Okay, family firms are outdated, small, little, okay, will not last too long. Okay, and that's what the Japanese colleagues told me about as well. But let's look a little bit about this. Let the data tell us about the story of ownership and control. Okay, can we consider this company as a family firm, given that it's so large like this? Okay, look at the history of who really controlled the top position of Toyota Motors from the beginning when Toyota Motors just started in 1930s. So up there. They are brothers, adopted brothers, okay, one adopted son of the family. They control and then started Toyota Motors. They died at more or less at the same time, about early 1950s. By the time the family didn't have mature son, okay, so they got salarymen to take control for a while until the son, one of them is a cousin, became mature and he took control. So Eiji Toyota has been controlling Toyota for so long until he died recently at 100 years old. Right, behind the scene of a lot of things. And then he trained up his nephew, and this person, Soichiro-san, is the son of Kiichiro-san, okay, and controlled the Toyota until now. I think many people think that he's behind the scene a lot as well. And his son is now here, okay. By the time, he also appointed his younger brother to be the president, okay. And then Toyota ran out of son for a while. Okay, what to do? Again, salaryman's coming up. Okay, and take control over Toyota until the son is mature enough, about 51-year-old, and he could take the reign again. Okay, we're thinking about this. The family had never exited Toyota Motors, right? Never exited, and somehow they have a very nice human resources to help them run the firm when the firm needed it, right? What about, now we're talking about top management position. What about the ownership structure? Have you want to see it? How does it look like? Okay, but before that, okay, so I'm going further. I'm curious about major companies that belong to the Toyota Group, okay? So I listed a few of them. They are listed companies, okay? And then I look at who really own them and run them, and you see that a lot of Toyota guys there, okay? These three of them are the son of Eiji Toyota, and you saw the guy would pass away at 100 years old, and he's controlled there. Okay, so you see these, at least four of them running the major firms in the Toyota groups. So now the Toyota groups look something like Samsung, some groups in Southeast Asia now, right? And we never thought of these at all. I think it's a bit shocking to us as well to look into the data. Now look into the ownership structure in 2015, you see this. It looks like a bit widely held, right? If you think about using a 10% ownership cutoff that we use in the literature, LLSV, among others, then this is widely held companies. Okay? No, it's not family firm. A Toyota family doesn't own much to be listed in the among the top 10 largest shareholders, right? But then you see Toyota Industry there, a little own something, and then you see Denso, which is a group firms, okay? So somehow it's a firm's own firm, so we're not sure. You look at this, we're not sure how to define this company. We just look at the ownership structure. And you go further in the history. So we have been collecting the data from 1949, after the Second World War, until now. And you look at this, for long term, the family never really owned anything a lot that appear in the top 10. Okay, but how could they control the firm then? So it's puzzling. We still don't understand, trying to understand from looking at the real data. And you look at those, the company still, the Toyota Industry is the first company of the family, still there as a shareholder, but they don't own that, never own that much, okay? But who are they among the shareholders? Okay, each side will tell us that they are banks, right? It looks like institutional shareholders, but who are they? When you look at them, zoom in closely. Let me show you a little bit. I thought it was interesting. Mitsui Bank, yeah, started, at least from our data, 1962. Mitsui Bank has been owning the share of Toyota for so long. Okay, so if you group those shareholders who have been holding a Toyota share for 40 consecutive years, we're going to get a block of 30%, okay? And it's super interesting, we thought here. You can try launch hostile takeover in this group because it looks like widely held, okay? But it never happened, right? Okay, and they will come up and then block you, okay? So yesterday we talked about this, right? The role of ownership, long-term, short-term, and who are insiders, okay? So maybe the family is insiders, stable owners, and then you have these financial institutions support the family. Maybe the family behind is in building some sort of networks that help them control the firm, okay? There are plenty of examples, but I'm not allowed to talk more because I was given 6 minutes. So Casio, the same thing, so I'm running a little bit. So, from the beginning until now, only the Casio families have been running the firm, and again, the ownership is less than 5% now, okay? It's amazing, and we don't understand much. So we experimented, okay, by broadening the definition of family firms, okay? What about if we define family firms, like if the founding family owns something among the largest shareholders, let's say top 10, or the family held a president or chairman position, okay? And let's count how many percent of the firms can be considered as family firms. Now we get more, okay? We get about 40%, 50%, depending on which year. So our data started from 1949, so it's very interesting to try to understand a lot of things, okay? Now, we look further, we were curious, okay? If we start another experiment, if you don't let the firm come in, okay? We look at the firm that went IPO before 1960s, okay? And then follow them until 2000. We were curious how many percent of family firms would die. Surprisingly, very few, right? You see that maybe 10% or plus, okay? Family firms are resilient, okay? And why is that? Okay, and I think we learned from literature, okay? LLSB among others saying that we should see family firms in a country with weak institutions, right? And Japan by now is not, I believe, it has stronger investor institution, strong institution, yet we see family firms among large firms, okay? Thank you. Sorry, I'm running.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome to Germany. This is going to be very boring and no pictures, and hopefully punctual. And I don't envy Curtis, who will have to tie my story, which is not a story, totally inconsistent observations together. But let me start with picking up the theme that Gerard has originally made in his presentation, saying that some forms of control, which are not necessarily linked to majority shareholdings, are not that new in history, and Germany, I think, is a prime example for that, because the Dance network of firms known as Germany Inc. is a primary example of precisely that, where we had basically the whole major firms in the German economy interlocked for more than 100 years through significant shareholdings of financial institutions, management overlaps, etc. And in a sense, these investors, or this structure of this industrial organization, was a little bit like Mireya's neat mutual funds and steroids, because they were deeply cartelizing the German economy. But they did one thing which is relevant for corporate governance, particularly the banks were the apex of this industrial organization. Actually, they did some monitoring services, as documented in the literature, particularly by the paper, the Gorton paper, which says that where these banks were present, they actually added value. And this is how the German economy, if you want to visualize that, looks like, and you will see that the financial institutions who only held minority stakes in these firms, but were still able to perform these monitoring functions due to some specific features in the institutional environment, particularly in the law, actually are an example of control. And one aspect that is relevant for corporate governance, I think, is that you have to be careful to adopt your institutional environment carefully when these players actually depart. And that happened at the beginning of the 21st century, leaving a relatively insufficient legal framework that does not allow to for other agents to perform the monitoring functions that they had. And let me just flip over to another aspect that Gerard was raising, which is families. And of course, families, in a sense, were always present in the German economy. So the old story is that they are the typical entrepreneurs who allow long-term investments, who implement their vision. And this phenomenon is also present nowadays if you look at recent control acquisitions by founding families, which are reacquisitions in a sense. You see that these firms are present in these industries that we're looking at, like car manufacturing and Continental, which you may know as a tire manufacturer, is also essentially a high-tech car supply provider. And these industries are in deep transition, and a little bit different to Maria Assunta's story. This presence of these anchor investors, long-term investors, can be perceived as facilitating this transition. And of course, another tiny aspect that I want to touch upon is the new types of founders. In Germany, there's not the Googles and Amazons, but there are some, I would say, close or at least somewhat similar scenarios. And particularly, we have a relatively lively startup scene in fintechs, but these fintechs may not be able to provide one of the key functions that Gerard was mentioning, which is actually inducing specific investments by showing that they are there for the long term, because simply at some stage they find it hard to finance future growth and thus have to rely on outside investors, actually have to sell out to these outside investors. And of course, this somehow defies the whole notion that there is a strong investor who's going to be present as a family for in the long run. So I just want to leave it here and flip over to.
So first of all, thank you, Gerard, for inviting me to this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. And given the time slot of 6 minutes, I'm not sure whether I'll manage to cover everything as Gerard requested, but I'm happy to provide some new perspectives from the corporate sector. So let me start off with some facts and figures around Zurich Insurance Group. It's a Swiss corporation based in Zurich, Switzerland, and it provides insurance services, property, casualty, and life insurance in more than 210 countries around the world. The group has currently 54,000 employees, and it's a listed company. It's a widely held public company with a market capitalization of 45 billion US dollars. And currently, the firm has 4 institutional investors with a significant stake. That is BlackRock with slightly above 5%, Norges Bank Capital Group, Legal & General with all closely or slightly above or below 3%. And looking at the shareholder base as of December 31st last year, it was 17.5% of all the outstanding shares that were held by private individuals, almost 4% held by foundations and pension funds, approximately 40% held by legal entities. And what are the implications of such dispersed ownership structure, in particular with regard to the accountability of Zurich's management? So, from our perspective, the early thesis by Berlin means that widely dispersed ownership does lead to an unaccountable management doesn't hold true for Zurich. And in fact, external stakeholders play a very important role in this regard. So first of all, I'd like to touch upon the role of Zurich's shareholders, institutional investors primarily. Those are highly influential. We have several fields of interaction with them. First of all, we have an investor day on an annual basis. This is where, in particular, strategy updates are being provided. We also do have corporate governance roadshows, usually held once a year. Those are events where we invite our top 30 investors and talk about corporate governance issues. It's a high-profile event with our chairman participating, the CFO, and other top executives, and very well received all the time. In addition to that, we have bilateral meetings in person. We have calls, email exchanges, of course, at all levels across the organization on an ongoing basis, and actually at a high frequency. In particular, with our top investors, we meet on a monthly basis at least. And the focus of these exchanges is twofold. It's related to financial performance, of course, and corporate governance issues. Secondly, I'd highlight a particularity about Switzerland, and that is the say-on-pay regime in Switzerland. You may know that in Switzerland, investors or shareholders in general do have a very strong say-on-pay in terms of a binding vote on the compensation for both the board and the executive management. And to be more precise, that is, on an annual basis, shareholders can vote upon the aggregate amount of compensation for the board and the executive committee. This is a prospective vote, and it is being complemented by a retrospective advisory vote on the compensation report. And given the binding character of this vote, it's regarding the actual pay. It's definitely recommendable to be closely in touch with your institutional investors, in particular prior to the AGM, to make sure the vote doesn't go wrong. So thirdly, I'd like to highlight the significant power of proxy advisors, which is steadily increasing. Here again, we have a close dialogue with the most relevant proxy advisors, particularly with ISS and Glass Lewis. And just looking at this year's AGM season in Switzerland, there were quite a few negative recommendations on the compensation reports of Swiss blue chips. For example, Credit Suisse, here the negative recommendations to vote against the compensation report were overwhelming, and it led the management to reduce the bonuses by 40% just a couple of days prior to the AGM, and this eventually saved the vote. And it's a great illustration of how powerful institutional investors and proxy advisors are these days. So also I'd like to highlight the role of the media, which shouldn't be underestimated. The reputation in the market and in society at large plays a significant role these days. As a big firm, you have to care about a variety of stakeholders, and that is not just the investors. It's also, of course, your employees. It's the communities. So corporate social responsibility plays an ever-increasing role, and reputational issues are of great importance. And so, in short, we think that external factors such as regulation and external stakeholders such as institutional investors or shareholders in general, proxy advisors, and the media, they are highly influential, and they hold Zurich's management accountable in many ways, in particular with regard to financial performance, of course, with regard to corporate governance issues, overall executive pay in particular, and corporate social responsibility, commitment and achievements. And this is why, from our perspective, the underlying principal-agent conflict is being balanced, if you wish, even though the ownership is highly dispersed. Given its size, Zurich is also a large institutional investor. We have an investment portfolio amounting to over $190 billion. And just on a side note, Zurich has outsourced the majority of its investment activities, but we still claim to retain full control, since there are very thoroughly defined governance processes that are governing the mandates of those external asset managers. So we have a very formalized process regarding the manager selection, Same is true for manager correction and deselection, of course. So and in addition, all the external managers, asset managers, are bound by our investment guidelines and voting guidelines in particular. So happy to comment on this in more detail later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel.
Okay, thanks, Gerard. I'm going to use my few minutes to talk about a very early stage project that I have with Ron. It's so early stage that what we have so far is a title and a metaphor. So the title is A Cambrian Explosion in Corporate Ownership and Governance, and I'll say a few words about the metaphor. So think back to your 8th grade science class. You learned that 540 million years ago, there was an abrupt appearance of many new life forms on Earth. And you also learned that when the fossil records of these life forms were discovered, they were poorly understood, and they were shoehorned into the existing taxonomic groupings of life forms to very little effect. It was essentially a futile effort to try to understand these life forms. So Ron and I think this is a very wonderful metaphor for both the proliferation of new forms of ownership and governance that are appearing around the world over the past decade or so, and also the futility of trying to understand these developments through use of the existing very simple dispersed versus concentrated share ownership taxonomy that's dominated our literature over the past 2 decades. So let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. I'm going to draw the examples from Asia because that's what I know best, but there are many examples from around the world. Ron's work with Jeff on the rise of agency capitalism in the United States also fits into this story. So first, I'll start with China, which offers many illustrations of disruptions in the conception of ownership and control. It illustrates the rise of sovereign ownership very dramatically through sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises. But even the term state-owned enterprise in the Chinese context is misleading because many of the globally active Chinese firms are of mixed ownership types in which private capital has been injected into a bundle of state assets. And given the political economy of China, the line between an SOE and a POE is a very blurry one because virtually all large successful firms in China have had to nestle up to the state and are subject to political forms of control by the Chinese party state. So there's an ambiguity about this dichotomy. Let me give you a more concrete example. Huawei, global Fortune 500 telecom manufacturer, was investigated by the House Intelligence Committee, and the House essentially threw up its hands and said, we can't figure out who controls this firm, so we recommend that it be barred from investing in the United States. Media typically reports that Huawei is owned by its employees through an ESOP. But this is misleading because the union that controls the ESOP is under the control of the firm's founder, who has close connections to the party, both by virtue of his position as a CEO and also by contract. So the founder has a contract with the union allowing the founder to veto major business decisions of the firm. Very different type of example, the so-called VIE structure in China, variable interest entity structure. So virtually all Chinese internet companies are structured as a VIE, and this is designed to circumvent Chinese government prohibitions on foreign ownership of sensitive industries like internet and media. So the VIE structure is foreign investors invest in an offshore company. They then have contractual rights with a Chinese operating company, which is set up by the founder of the actual business. And what's interesting about the VIE structure is that these contracts simply disaggregate and mimic equities rights to governance and cash flow. So by contract, the foreign investors have cash flow rights over the Chinese operating company, and they have governance rights over the operating company. It's not called equity. This is by contract, but somehow this is able to circumvent Chinese government restrictions on foreign ownership. Give you an example from Japan, also illustrating sovereign ownership in a very different way. So as part of the Abenomics monetary policy program, the Bank of Japan has been massively buying assets in this country. So the Bank of Japan today is a top 5 shareholder in 80 Nikkei 225 companies, and it's projected to be the largest shareholder in 50 Nikkei 225 companies by the end of this year. But it didn't achieve that position by buying equity, by buying common stock. It achieved that position by buying ETFs. ETFs don't vote, but they soak up public float of companies. So just to give you one example, Uniqlo, the clothing retailer, the publicly listed holding company of Uniqlo, 50% of its public float has been soaked up by the BOJ's ETF purchases. So I think there's a considerable concern that the Bank of Japan's ETF purchases are going to counteract another of the Abenomics policies, which we heard about yesterday, which is to try to improve corporate governance by invigorating institutional investor ownership and market discipline. So in effect, the BOJ has become a gigantic passive institutional investor in this country with, I think, really quite uncertain impact on corporate governance here. Last example from Korea, the quintessential controlling shareholder regime. It's long been assumed that the minority investors in a controlling shareholder regime are passive and completely ineffectual vis-a-vis the controller. But today we're seeing minority block holders in controlling shareholder regimes. Good illustration of this is Elliott Management's attempts to restructure the Samsung Group, the largest and most powerful chaebol in Korea. So these are just a few examples of the kind of developments taking place around the world, disrupting settled notions of ownership and control. And I think the consequences might be quite significant. If you think about the way that settled notions of ownership and control have generated forms of measurement, regulatory regimes that pivot on these conventional notions of ownership. I mean, think about rules for consolidated accounting, rules for securities disclosures, rules on government ownership for national security screening purposes. All of these might be unsettled by these new forms of ownership and control. So I'll just close by returning to the point that I started with. Well, really, one other point here, which is I think Ron and I are of the conclusion that ownership and control today, the meaning of those terms really is very highly situational. It's very highly localized, and I think some of the other panelists illustrated that as well. That may not be a new concept, but it really has not been picked up, I think, very deeply in the literature. And so just to end where I started, I think it's going to be difficult or perhaps futile to try to understand these developments by reference to our very simple dispersed versus concentrated ownership taxonomy. Thanks.
Thank you, Curtis. So the temporary conclusion of this panel, I guess, is that firms are controlled by owners that are not very large and that are, to a certain degree, personally or emotionally related to the firm, which is not exactly new, but not generally acknowledged either. And so I think it's time to give the floor to you guys for questions or comments. Anyone? Yes. Katarina.
So I'm really wondering what's new, or what is the, what is sort of the crazy thing that we really believed for how many decades that there was really only the distinction between dispersed and concentrated ownership? And is it, or is it just that we are rediscovering that there's much more variation on the theme, has always been much more variation on the theme than we pretended to in the corporate governance debates? That's one point. More importantly, I think, Otto von Gierke in the 19th century in Germany has written about the enormous variation in firm organization. And I think to some extent, actually, it was reduced by the corporate form. So we had a dominant form that emerged at a certain point in time. So we're now coming to a point where we see maybe a little bit more variation. But I think the most radical new things I see in China, as Curtis described, and maybe also with this Bank of Japan model, is new. The family ownership is not new. In Germany, family ownership is, you didn't mention Tobias the Mittelstand. I was missing that a little bit, and how important that still is today, sort of the small and medium-sized enterprise family-owned businesses that are really the drivers of innovation in Germany, not only at the high-tech end, but elsewhere as well. So I think there's a lot of variation and recombination of old stuff. There's some new kind of structures, but I'm not really convinced yet that it's really fundamentally different from what we've seen over the last couple of decades, and I'm really not convinced yet that it's increasing the variation of firms in comparison to what we've seen prior to the rise of the major corporation?
Just say a couple things. I think some things are new. I mean, certainly some of this is not new, and some of it is simply realizing that our old forms of analysis and taxonomy aren't very helpful and very descriptive. But I think there are some new things. I mean, I think the rise of sovereign ownership in the global economy is new. I think the rise of powerful, aggressive block holders in controlling shareholder regimes is new. Passive ownership is new, I think. I mean, at this scale, I think it's new. So I think there are some developments that are novel.
Maybe just one reaction. I mean, I think I totally agree, because what we see is indeed, it very much depends on the level of abstraction. So phenomena are new. But in general, of course, no one ever believed that there is a dichotomic structure or anything like that. And the variation, I think the main takeaway is that these things actually change over time, and that requires you to adjust the institutional environment too. And I think that's something that has not been picked up in literature.
On. Hello, does it work? So something that seems to be new out there is the development of people with an equity investment in firms who don't have control, who are barred from control. The limited partnership was originally developed to deny control to people who had limited liability, because the thought was for creditor protection reasons, you didn't want to give anybody control if they didn't have anybody limited liability if they had any control. If they had control, the only way they'd be responsible to creditors was if they had unlimited liability. We flipped that. Today we use the limited partnership to deny control to people because we don't want them to put their hands on the steering wheel. And it's a method of delegating a control to specialists while denying it to the equity investors, almost all the equity investors. And dual-class stock is the same sort of thing, of course. And I wonder if we aren't seeing a part of the Cambrian explosion is a set of investment forms, of functioning firms, productive firms, that are designed to deny equity investors any control. The net earnings flow in bulk to people who have no control rights whatsoever, and it's intended that way. It isn't a matter of just having a few shares of stock, or have to be able to organize. Even large investors have no control rights. So I wonder if this is a new animal in the zoo, and there are several new animals in the zoo, and whether you all agree this is a pattern that's likely to grow.
So my reaction to that, Henry, is that as soon as you start denying control to some people, it means other people take control, right? And you do take control with very small stakes, which was the general feeling here. Now the question is, who is exercising this control? And I guess it depends, but there are not that many. I think our conclusions was there are not that many models there. And overwhelmingly, if you look over time, it's people who are closer to the firm. Now, there are periods of times where there might be outside private equity firms and so on and so forth. But generally, they're also very close to the industry, so it's hard to tell. And I think our conclusion is it's normally people who are either more familiar with the business or express confidence to the people they exclude so as to still allow access to capital in a way that remains reasonable.
Let me just push it a little further. There's sometimes the controlling party has no equity, no interest in the earnings whatsoever. And some of it's institutional. Mutual insurance and bank holding companies in America are essentially nonprofit entities that have a controlling interest in a bank. Sometimes a very large bank or a large insurance company, and nobody on the board of the controlling entity has a net earning stake as a right to net earnings. They're self-perpetuating. Industrial foundations all over Northern Europe, in the Tata Industry Group, same thing. They're controlled by nonprofit entities, an autonomous board that has no stake in the earnings, really. They're just fiduciaries. American hospitals being organized this way with nonprofit holding companies. There seem to be a whole generation of sometimes large firms. Maersk Shipping, the largest container shipping company in the world, is run this way. You know? So it seems to me we're seeing a large group of entities run by professional fiduciaries who have no ownership stake in it. And we're explicitly denying control to most of the people who get the net earnings out of the institution.
That's true. It depends also on the relative share. But I think, if I remember correctly, the data, 85% of the firms are controlled, but people having equity stakes. Now, that covers the whole world, which makes maybe the data a bit messy. And what's interesting in your comment is to decide what share of the pie are those entities covering? Is it specialized, and is it specifically US, or also seen in many other jurisdictions out of the world, which I'm not exactly sure about?
Maybe just a tiny add-on. I think you have to look very close at particularly structures of foundations, because that actually may be a structure to perpetuate family influence. So in that sense, you might actually just use, again, a legal form in order to achieve something that has been always present.
Well, and then just, we have to say the word snap in this conversation as well. A firm that went public with no voting rights, shares with no voting rights. It's, you asked whether this is going to increase. I think to some extent, be interesting to see how the market continues to react to Snap and what happens to its shares. So I agree, it's a pretty astonishing development, taken to an extreme to go public with non-voting shares. It's not the same point that you were making about foundations, but it's of that same, it's another animal in the zoo, as you said.
Alan.
Well, I had a comment very related to what Curtis said. Just said, which is Google as well as Facebook issued non-voting shares, basically guaranteeing that the founders remain in power forever. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the market value of a minority Google share after this issuance, that there's a positive and not trivial market value of the vote for a minority share. And you know that because if you compare the value of a minority share with a vote is worth more than a minority share without the vote. So there's market value for the vote, even though the founders are going to be in power forever. I find that very puzzling, but it's economically significant.
All right. Yes. Amir.
So I'll take advantage of the zoo metaphor. So now that we have so many new and strange animals all around us, especially in this part of the world, I'd be interested to kind of hear your response to the fact that inside them, they're pretty much the same. In the following sense, not to beat this metaphor too much, they all have a heart, they all have blood circulation, except for the insects. Okay, we don't consider those. In the sense that the rules of conduct are pretty much the same for the people who operate these corporate animals, corporate monsters, to the extent that even in this part of the world, in Asia, legislators adopt Western, American even, rules of conduct, particularly fiduciary duty. Japan has had it for several decades. Korea adopted an American-style fiduciary duty of loyalty after the financial crisis. Even China's the new companies law has the same kind of rule. And just be interested to listen to you thinking about the fit of these basic conduct rules with the new variety of corporate forms in terms of ownership in particular?
Maybe. I think my answer, as you might infer from our last week's conversation, is pretty clear. I say that they're not. I mean, the very basic concepts, I think they are adaptable, but they have to be adapted, and I think that's the key message here. That particularly in implementing certain corporate governance institutions, we have to be very careful about the context in which they are applied, and thus adopt accordingly what we actually mean by control. Because I think the control concept is valid, but just have to look closer what actually it means, and it's not necessarily tied to share ownership and stuff like that. I think that's the gist of the discussion that we have.
I think a lot depends on the local markets and how they react. So, I mean, the rules are similar, but I think the markets react very differently. So just to take Japan as an example, I mean, the legal rights for shareholders in Japan are, if anything, more robust than for shareholders in the United States, but they haven't traditionally been utilized vis-a-vis management. So there's a real question about how and whether institutional investors will make use of those tools. Similarly, in Korea, so this Elliott Management foray against Samsung is a good illustration. The National Pension Fund voted with Samsung in this case for probably a variety of complicated reasons, some of which are political, and their vote mattered. I mean, it tipped the scales in the outcome of that case. So I think it comes down to the reaction of major players in the local markets and whether they begin to change their mindset and their behavior.
I'm puzzled by the extent to which governance failures or catastrophic failures will or won't have impact on these ownership / governance relationships. So I'm thinking the Volkswagen case, right? I mean, that's like Enron squared and cubed, probably. And it's a very substantial German firm. I mean, Enron was, kind of a Ponzi scheme. It was, a fraudulent thing to begin with, right? And so, question there's a huge shock to a major German firm, and ownership and the control that flowed from it is probably one of the causal factors. So, question mark, will it matter going forward? Similarly, in Japan, the Toshiba firm, again, a catastrophe. What difference will it make for the governance system and the pattern of ownership and interlocking relationships associated there? And Korea, when you're arresting the the CEO of the firm for various internal things, including the effort to bribe the president, you'd think that might have some. I mean, that's a significant thing. And so the question is, will these governance eruptions that stem in significant ways from this particular ownership pattern, different ones, have any long-run effect or not? And if not, what does that say about the adaptability of systems to even the worst sort of evidence of the failure of how they function?
Well, probably, I think the Volkswagen case is really, it's an egregious example for illustrating essentially all relatively old-fashioned stories about, for example, state ownership, which plays a role. We can make also the case that going forward, that might not necessarily help. Also, family presence might not necessarily help in really overhauling the structures. At least the pressure that Mario Sunter was hinting at is obviously missing, so there's not anybody really selling, so there's no pressure from that. So, but the Volkswagen case also, again, is different, I think, because the pressure will mainly come from product markets, actually, and I think that's going to be the game changer. So maybe ownership structure in that case doesn't matter that much, but I think
leading up to the case, ownership structure mattered a lot.
Just to ask a little bit about Toshiba case, right? I don't know if you agree or not, as Japanese scholars agree or not. When I have been working on Japanese data, and you see that from the data as well, that you have these among large shareholders. There are what we call stable shareholders, right? They have been with the firms for so long. And I have been wondering whether they will ask any difficult questions at all to the large shareholders. And apparently it looks like they are, I think we call them silent shareholders. Don't really ask difficult questions. And you look at the board structure and who are they? Okay, basically they are insiders. Okay, it really listen that they introduce the outsider system in there. But if you're outsider in the Japanese system and you're invited to be on the board, would you really ask difficult questions? And if you do so, next year they were not going to invite you anymore. So I don't know whether there any governance mechanism really govern Japanese large corporations.
All right, I think we're getting to a close of the hour devoted to this panel. I think I learned two things by preparing and listening to this. First, control seems to be more pervasive than we normally think with relatively small stakes. But, and that's my reaction to Alan, it doesn't mean that control is absolute. And it makes a lot of sense even if you do have voting shares that are not giving control. Of course, by voting those, you send a signal to the controller, which by then, as Lisa pointed out, influence the way control is exercised. So control is not absolute. And this is also why it's explaining that it can have a relatively smaller amount of share that do not give you control. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a little coffee break here. It's probably designed for people having jet lag. We should be back here in 15 minutes so that we can do